The morning sun stretched across the waters of Tawi-Tawi anchorage on June 13, 1944. Here, in the remote reaches of the southwestern Philippines, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered for what would become one of the most decisive battles of the Pacific War. At the heart of this mighty force stood the aircraft carrier Shokaku. Her flight deck, nearly 850 feet long, had once launched the aircraft that struck Pearl Harbor only 2.5 years earlier. She was a symbol of Japanese power and ambition, but on this day, she unknowingly sailed toward her final voyage. Neither her crew of 1,763 men nor their commanders could imagine the silent hunter already waiting to end her journey. Just 6 days later, Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship as Japan's first mobile fleet prepared to depart. The sight was breathtaking. 3 great carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho, moved in formation, shielded by heavy cruisers Atago, Takao, Maya, and Chokai, with 13 destroyers forming a deadly protective ring. This was the last great gathering of Japanese carrier, strength in the Pacific, a force that had once ruled the seas from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. But this was no ordinary mission. This departure was a desperate gamble, a final attempt to turn back the tide of war that had shifted against Japan since the disaster at Midway. As anchor chains roared and the colossal warships began to move, thousands of sailors stood ready at their posts. None could foresee that within a single week, more than 200 of them would sink beneath the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. Their destination was the Mariana Islands, where American forces had begun their assault on Saipan. The mission was bold, even reckless. Japan's fleet would strike with one aim, the total destruction of the United States Pacific Fleet's carriers. By mid-1944, Japan's strategic situation had collapsed into crisis. The empire that had expanded so quickly in 1941 and early 1942 was now shrinking under the relentless pressure of American forces. The loss of the Gilbert Islands, the isolation of Truk, and now the American assault on the Marianas were not just territorial defeats. They were the clear signals of an approaching endgame in the Pacific War. Among these islands, Saipan carried a special weight. If captured, it would place the powerful American B-29 Superfortress bombers within striking distance of Tokyo itself. For the first time since the daring Doolittle raid, the war would come directly to the Japanese homeland. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, understood the full gravity of this moment. The fall of the Marianas would sever Japan's vital lifeline to its resource-rich southern territories and expose the home islands to devastating strategic bombing. In response, he gave the order for Operation Ago. This plan was ambitious. It sought to use Japan's remaining advantages: the longer range of its carrier aircraft, the support of land-based aviation from island airfields, and the deadly accuracy of Japanese battleship gunners in night combat. The mobile fleet would strike the American carriers at their most vulnerable moment, while they were tied down supporting the landings at Saipan. Yet the Japanese Navy of 1944 was not the same force that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor. Its greatest weakness was the loss of experienced pilots. The veterans who had carried out the precise attacks at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Colombo were gone, lost in the brutal battles of Midway, the Solomons, and the Santa Cruz Islands. In their place were hastily trained replacements. Many of the young aviators aboard Shokaku and her sister carriers had fewer than 200 flying hours. Their American counterparts, by comparison, often had more than 800. Even fuel had become a crisis. Japan's merchant fleet, relentlessly hunted by American submarines, could no longer guarantee the transport of vital oil from the East Indies to the home islands. The Imperial Navy was preparing for one last gamble, but it would do so with exhausted crews, inexperienced pilots, and dwindling fuel supplies. The Japanese fleet was forced to sail on unrefined crude oil pumped straight from the wells of Borneo. This thick, sulfur-heavy, fuel-choked engines poured black smoke into the sky and slowed the fleet to a crawl. Inside the engine rooms, crews worked in unbearable conditions as toxic fumes filled the air, turning every shift into a battle for breath. Even with these crippling challenges, Vice Admiral Ozawa's fleet still appeared formidable on paper. 9 aircraft carriers carried nearly 440 planes, supported by 5 battleships, including the mighty Yamato and Musashi, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. Across the Pacific, Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the United States' Fifth Fleet. His forces dwarfed the Japanese, 15 carriers launching more than 950 aircraft, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The Americans held every advantage: numbers, pilot experience, radar technology, and an unstoppable supply chain. Yet Ozawa believed that with clever tactics and careful timing, he might still seize victory. The contest between Ozawa and Spruance had begun even before their fleet sailed. Japanese intelligence had correctly predicted that the Marianas would be the next American objective. This gave Ozawa the chance to position his fleet for a counterattack. His plan was daring. The Japanese carriers would stay beyond the range of American planes, using their own longer-ranged aircraft to strike from a safe distance. Japanese carrier aircraft, stripped of armor and protection to save weight, could attack from 300 miles away. By contrast, American planes could only fight effectively within 200 miles. Ozawa also relied on support from more than 500 land-based aircraft stationed on Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Yap. These planes would strike first, softening the American fleet before the carriers delivered the killing blow. In theory, the combined assault of land and carrier aircraft would overwhelm American defenses and open the way for decisive strikes. With this vision in mind, the Japanese admiral divided his fleet into 3 powerful groups, ready to spring the trap. The Japanese fleet was divided into 3 powerful forces. Van Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita sailed with the light carriers. Force A, led by Ozawa himself aboard the carrier Taiho, included the Shokaku and Zuikaku. Force B, commanded by Rear Admiral Takagi Joshima, carried the remaining carriers. On the other side, Admiral Raymond Spruance faced a difficult challenge. His primary mission was to protect the American landings at Saipan, yet he also knew that destroying the Japanese fleet could decide the future of the Pacific. Intelligence from coast watchers and intercepted signals confirmed that a major Japanese naval force was approaching. What remained unclear was its exact size and purpose. To counter this threat, Spruance positioned Task Force 58, 4 powerful carrier groups west of the Marianas. This created a barrier between the Japanese fleet and the invasion beaches. Beneath the surface, another critical element of the American strategy was already in motion. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the submarine force, had studied Japanese naval patterns and predicted their movements. He believed that any Japanese relief fleet would have to pass through the Philippine Sea. To intercept them, he deployed his submarines in a long patrol line, a net he called the NA line. 4 submarines, Albacore, Bang, Finback, and Stingray, took up precise positions, forming an invisible wall across the ocean. This silent defense would act as an early warning system for the approaching fleet. But history often turns on the unexpected. One submarine, not originally part of Lockwood's plan, was about to change the course of the battle. The USS Cavalla, on her very first war patrol, found herself on a collision path with destiny. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, had been ordered to patrol east of the Philippines. Yet shifting events soon placed his boat directly in the path of Ozawa's advancing fleet. The USS Cavalla, SS-244, was one of the most advanced submarines of her time. Built at the Electric Boat Company's shipyard in Groton, Connecticut, she was a Gato-class fleet submarine, part of a group of 77 boats that formed the backbone of America's undersea warfare in 1944. The USS Cavalla's story began in 1943. She was laid down on March 4th and launched on November 14th of the same year. On February 29, 1944, she was commissioned under the command of Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler, a 36-year-old career naval officer from Ohio and a graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis. At 301 feet in length and displacing more than 1,500 tons on the surface, Cavalla was a powerful weapon of war. Her pressure hull, made from high-tensile steel, was designed to withstand depths of up to 400 feet, though her official test depth was listed at 300. She was driven by 4 Fairbanks-Morse diesel engines, generating more than 5,000 horsepower on the surface, and by 4 General Electric motors producing 2,700 horsepower when submerged. On the surface, she could reach speeds over 20 knots, while underwater she could manage nearly 9. Her endurance was equally impressive. She could sail 11,000 nautical miles at a steady 10 knots on the surface, though underwater her batteries limited her to only 2 days at 2 knots. The Cavalla's primary weapons were her torpedoes. 10 21-inch tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, carried a total of 24 Mark 14 or Mark 18 torpedoes. Each was more than 20 feet long, weighing over 3,000 pounds, and armed with a 643-pound Torpex warhead, powerful enough to break the spine of all but the most heavily armored warships. Earlier in the war, these torpedoes had been plagued with defects, but by 1944 most of those flaws had been fixed. Now Cavalla carried some of the most reliable torpedoes the Navy had ever fielded. Her secondary weapons included a 5-inch deck, gun with 200 rounds, and 50 caliber machine guns for anti-aircraft defense. 72 officers and enlisted men formed Cavalla's crew. They had spent 3 months in intensive training before leaving for their first patrol. Life aboard a submarine was unlike anything else in the Navy. Men lived and worked in impossibly close quarters, forging a bond of trust and dependence that was absolute. Every man aboard had to qualify on every system, from the commanding officer down to the youngest seaman. In an emergency, anyone might have to operate the diving planes, adjust the trim tanks, or fire the torpedoes. The Cavalla's technology represented the cutting edge of undersea warfare. Her SJ surface search radar could detect ships up to 12 miles away, while her SD air search radar warned of approaching aircraft. Together, these systems gave the submarine a decisive edge in the deadly chess match of the Pacific. The USS Cavalla carried some of the most advanced technology of its time. Her ST periscope radar, though temperamental, allowed her crew to measure precise distances during attack runs. Below the surface, JK sound gear gave the boat the ability to track targets by sound, primitive by later standards, but still vital in 1944. At the heart of her firepower was the Torpedo Data Computer, the TDC. This electromechanical analog computer blended target speed, course, range, and bearing with the submarine's own movement to calculate deadly firing solutions. Cavalla's journey into history began on June 4, 1944, when she left Midway Island on her very first war patrol. She had reached Pearl Harbor just weeks earlier, after a 5,000-mile voyage from Connecticut through the Panama Canal, and then continued to Midway for her final preparations. There, her captain Herman Kossler and his officers received their last briefings, loaded provisions and ammunition, and made the final repairs. The crew enjoyed what they knew might be their last taste of liberty, though Midway offered far fewer comforts than Pearl Harbor. Cavalla's assigned patrol zone lay east of the Philippines, guarding the approaches to the San Bernardino Strait and Surigao Strait. These 2 narrow passages were lifelines for Japanese ships moving between the home islands and the oil-rich territories of the Netherlands East Indies. Kossler's orders were clear: attack enemy shipping, gather intelligence, and serve as a scout for the wider American operations in the Pacific. The first days at sea passed quietly. Cavalla's crew settled into the relentless rhythm of submarine life, 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off, divided between sleep, meals, and endless maintenance of the boat's machinery. At night she ran on the surface, her powerful diesel engines recharging the massive batteries and pushing her swiftly toward her patrol area. By day she submerged to avoid the eyes of Japanese aircraft, crawling silently at just 3 knots to conserve her power. Then, on June 8th, while transiting the waters near Marcus Island, nearly 200 miles southeast of Tokyo, Cavalla encountered the first strange incident of her patrol. On June 8th, the ocean delivered Cavalla an unusual surprise. The officer of the deck reported a sudden jolt from the stern, followed by what seemed like a pool of blood in the boat's wake. Captain Kossler immediately ordered the engines stopped and sent men to inspect the propellers and stern planes. Finding no damage, he concluded they had struck a small whale, one of many that roamed these waters. The incident was minor, but it reminded the crew that the sea itself carried dangers beyond enemy action. As Cavalla pressed on, the weather began to change. By June 14th, as she neared her patrol area, the barometer dropped steadily. Winds rose and waves built to 15 feet, crashing over the bridge and forcing seawater down the conning tower. Hatch. The submarine pitched and rolled violently. Men were thrown from their bunks, dishes shattered in the galley, and seasickness spread through the crew. For 18 long hours, Kossler battled the storm. He tried to send a weather report back to Pearl Harbor, information vital to American air operations, but the storm's fury drowned out every signal. At last he ordered Cavalla beneath the surface, where the sea was calmer. There, hidden below the waves, the submarine rode out the typhoon. By June 15th, the storm had passed. Cavalla surfaced to find clear skies and a calmer sea. Almost immediately, her radio operator intercepted a message. The submarine USS Flying Fish had spotted a Japanese task force moving east at high speed, but could not close to attack. The news electrified Cavalla's crew. Major Japanese warships had been rare sights since 1942. Now the chance to strike at capital ships was suddenly real. Kossler wasted no time. He ordered a new course to intercept, pushing Cavalla's diesels hard at 17 knots through the still rough seas. Soon they linked up with another submarine, the USS Pipefish. Together the two boats spread out across the enemy's projected course, 20 miles apart, sweeping the ocean for signs of the Japanese fleet. All through the night of June 15th, the lookouts strained their eyes for silhouettes against the horizon, while the radar operator kept the SJ scope sweeping for contacts. By dawn, after covering more than 200 miles, frustration set in. No ships, no fleet. The Japanese had either changed course or outrun the search. Disappointed, Kossler ordered Cavalla back toward her assigned patrol zone, but the brief glimpse of action had charged the crew with anticipation. They now knew that major Japanese fleet units were moving in the region, and a confrontation was no longer just a possibility, it was almost certain. Late on the night of June 16th, the radar operator suddenly reported multiple contacts to the southwest. 5 or 6 vessels, moving together at moderate speed. Kossler rushed to the conning tower. The scope showed 2 large ships, likely tankers or transports, screened by 3 or 4 smaller warships, probably destroyers. This was exactly the kind of target submarines were expected to engage. Kossler gave the order, battle stations. Cavalla began her attack run, but soon the approach proved far more difficult than expected. The Japanese escorts were sharp and relentless. Their active sonar pings echoed through the dark water, followed by sudden, unpredictable course changes. Each time Cavalla crept into what looked like a firing position, a destroyer swung toward them, forcing Kossler to dive deep and wait in silence. For 3 exhausting hours, the cat-and-mouse game continued. Cavalla never managed to get closer than 4,000 yards. Then came the most dangerous moment. A destroyer turned straight for them, charging directly over Cavalla's position. Emergency dive, 300 feet, silent running. Kossler ordered. The submarine dropped into the depths, the hull groaning under pressure as the sound of the destroyer's propellers thundered above them. Every man aboard held his breath. Minutes felt like hours until, at last, the noise faded into the distance. When Cavalla surfaced again at 0200 on June 17th, the ocean was empty. The convoy had disappeared into the night. Kossler was frustrated but not defeated. This was submarine warfare, victory and failure separated by moments of chance. What he did not yet know was how close Cavalla had come to changing history. The ships he had hunted were fleet oilers, the lifeblood of Ozawa's mobile fleet. Had they been destroyed, Japan's carriers would have faced fuel starvation before the coming battle. Sometimes in war the strikes never made can be as significant as those that land. By the afternoon of June 17th, new orders crackled over Cavalla's radio. Based on multiple sightings and decoded signals, Admiral Lockwood was certain a major Japanese fleet movement was underway. Cavalla was ordered to new coordinates, 13°0 north, 137°0 east, 350 miles west of Guam. Kossler quickly plotted the new course. Every knot of speed mattered now. The Japanese fleet was coming, and Cavalla had to be there first. At 1945 hours that evening, the radar operator reported a faint return, bearing 290D, range 30,000 yards. The contact was weak, appearing and vanishing with each sweep of the SJ radar, but Kossler immediately turned to close. Within minutes, more echoes appeared on the screen. 2, then 4, then 7 distinct contacts. By 2015 hours, the picture was clear. This was no convoy. The radar showed at least 7 large ships, steaming at 19 knots on a heading northeast toward the Marianas. They zigzagged in formation, a classic anti-submarine defense. Careful plotting suggested at least one aircraft carrier, several heavy cruisers or battleships, and a ring of destroyer screens. Cavalla had stumbled into the path of Japan's striking arm. Now Kossler faced the hardest decision of his career. The submarine was in perfect attack position. A spread of torpedoes could cripple or even sink a capital ship, but the discovery itself was priceless. Admiral Spruance's fleet needed to know, here, now, exactly where the Japanese were. After a brief tense conference with his executive officer, Kossler made his choice. He would sacrifice the glory of an attack. Cavalla would surface and send a contact report. Information, in this moment, was the deadliest weapon of all. To surface a submarine so close to enemy warships was to defy every instinct of submarine warfare. Yet Kossler knew the risk had to be taken. At 21:45, once the Japanese formation had slipped beyond visual range, Cavalla broke the surface of the tropical night. Inside the cramped radio room, the operator keyed the urgent message onto the submarine command frequency. Large enemy task force. Latitude 13 degrees north, longitude 136 degrees 30 east, course 045, speed 19 knots. Composition: at least one carrier, several battleships or cruisers, multiple destroyers. The word sped across the Pacific. Within minutes, the signal reached Pearl Harbor and was relayed to Admiral Spruance aboard USS Indianapolis. For the first time, the Americans had a clear, confirmed sighting of Japan's carrier strike force. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, though Kossler and his crew could not know it, had begun with their report. With confirmation sent and acknowledgement received, Cavalla slipped once more beneath the waves, straining to regain contact. But even at maximum submerged speed, she could not match the 19-knot pace of Ozawa's fleet. By dawn on June 18th, Kossler made the hard call to abandon pursuit and resume his assigned patrol position. The crew felt the sting of disappointment. No torpedoes had been fired, no enemy ships struck. Yet Kossler reassured them. That message may be worth more than a dozen torpedoes. We gave the fleet what it needed most: time and knowledge. Still, Cavalla's greatest moment was yet to come. On June 18th, the submarine maintained a tense routine, submerged during the day, surfacing briefly after dark to breathe air, recharge batteries and receive radio traffic. The ether crackled with coded transmissions, signals of fleets maneuvering unseen across the Philippine Sea. Something vast was unfolding, though Cavalla had no full picture. Their orders were simple: hold position and strike any enemy ship that crossed their path. At a 3:45 on June 19th, the uneasy calm shattered. A low-flying aircraft roared directly overhead. The officer of the deck barely managed to sound the alarm. Before Cavalla crash-dived, bow plunging as ballast tanks flooded. Men braced for the concussions of depth bombs, but none came. Perhaps the plane had not seen them, or carried no ordnance to drop. After 30 tense minutes, Cavalla edged back to periscope depth. As dawn spread across the sea, fate revealed its hand. By pure chance, or by the chaotic dance of fleets, the submarine now lay directly in the path of Ozawa's main carrier force. The hunters had become the hunted, and Cavalla was about to write her name into history. Admiral Ozawa believed his fleet was still undetected. At 8:30, his first wave of aircraft thundered into the sky, bound for the American carriers. As they departed, the Japanese carriers swung into the wind, recovering their combat air patrol and preparing for another strike. At 10:48, deep below the Philippine Sea, Cavalla's sonar operator stiffened. "High-speed screws bearing 070. The sound was unmistakable. Warships. Kossler snapped up the periscope for a fleeting glance. The tall pagoda masts of Japanese ships pierced the horizon. He dropped it at once. Battle stations, submerged. The crew responded with practiced precision. Torpedo rooms were readied. Trim adjusted. The plotting party hunched over charts. As bearings streamed in. At 10:52, Kossler risked another look. His heart quickened. A large aircraft carrier loomed into view, flanked by a heavy cruiser and destroyers. Aircraft circled above, waiting to land. The flight deck was crowded. Planes parked with wings extended, vulnerable as targets in a shooting gallery. Range 12,000 yards. Too far, but closing fast. Every minute brought fresh tension. Cavalla crept silently, trying to slip between escort destroyers without being detected. Kossler limited periscope use to seconds at a time. The TDC operator worked furiously, updating firing solutions. By 11:10, the target filled the lens. A Shokaku-class carrier, its profile, offset island, and anti-aircraft gun layout unmistakable. Range 5,000 yards, perfect broadside angle, but danger loomed. The destroyer Urakazi shifted course, threatening to block Cavalla's shot. Kossler had seconds to decide, wait and risk losing the carrier, or fire now and hope. He chose fire. One. The submarine jolted as compressed air hurled the first torpedo into the sea, then another and another, 6 in total, launched at 8-second intervals, spreading in a deadly fan. Depth set at 15 feet, enough to punch through vital spaces just below the waterline. Take her deep, flood negative, full dive on the bull planes. Cavalla plunged. The crew clung to handholds as she angled downward, racing into the dark. Then, boom, the submarine shook with the shockwave of the first hit. A grim smile spread across tense faces. 8 seconds later, a second detonation. Then a third. 3 hits confirmed. On Shokaku, chaos erupted. Lookouts spotted torpedo wakes too late. Orders screamed for hard rudder and full speed, but fate had already arrived. The first torpedo smashed into the carrier midships, ripping open the boiler room and flooding it in seconds. The second tore into aviation fuel tanks forward, igniting firestorms across the hangar deck where planes were parked and fueled. The third struck near the forward elevator, locking it in place and crippling flight operations. Shokaku groaned as tons of seawater poured in, her starboard list growing worse by the minute. Smoke and flame belched skyward, a death signal visible. For miles, Cavalla had just delivered one of the most devastating blows of the Pacific submarine war. Aboard Shokaku, chaos reigned. Damage control teams fought desperately against flooding, but aviation gasoline fires roared through the hangar spaces, feeding on the aircraft stored there. The carrier's captain, Matsubara Hiroshi, ordered counter-flooding to correct the starboard list. It worked briefly, but the measure only robbed the ship of her reserve buoyancy. Within minutes of the torpedo strikes, Shokaku staggered, her speed falling to 12 knots. Flames rolled skyward. The once proud carrier was mortally wounded. Beneath the waves, Cavalla's crew barely had time to savor their victory. 2 minutes after the last torpedo left its tube, the first depth charges erupted above them. The escorts had reacted instantly, either sighting Cavalla's periscope or tracing back the deadly white wakes of her torpedoes. The submarine dove hard, passing 300 feet, near her test depth. Then the ocean thundered. Depth charges detonated in savage patterns, shockwaves slamming into her steel hull. Light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained from the overhead. The pressure made the submarine groan like a living thing in pain. Silent. Running, Kossler ordered. Every unnecessary system was shut down. The crew slipped off their shoes, moving in stocking feet to mask the faintest sound. Air conditioning went offline, and the temperature inside the boat soared. Sweat rolled down faces. Breathing grew shallow as the air grew stale. At 11:35, 6 depth charges detonated so close that men were thrown against bulkheads. Battery gauges dipped lower. In the maneuvering room, electricians silently calculated how long the submarine could endure. At 11:44, the sonar operator froze. "Destroyer overhead!" The men listened to the terrifying crescendo of screws churning directly above them. Then silence, no depth charges. Either the destroyer had lost them, or it was repositioning. Kossler seized the chance. New course, slow and quiet. Cavalla crept away, altering depth between 250 and 400 feet, using the Pacific's thermal layers to confuse sonar. For 2 agonizing hours, the deadly dance continued. Explosions shook the water intermittently, but farther and farther away. Finally, just after 13 us, the sonar operator reported only 1 destroyer left in close pursuit. The others had broken off, drawn back to protect their stricken carrier. Cavalla had survived, for now. Above them, Shokaku was dying by the minute. At 13:32, the sonar room aboard Cavalla went silent. Then faintly, a strange sound filtered through the hydrophones. "Breaking up noises," the operator whispered. The unmistakable groans and snaps of steel surrendering to the sea. For 30 minutes, the eerie chorus continued, each crack and rumble echoing the death struggle of a great ship far above them. Then at 14:08, 4 titanic explosions shook even Cavalla's hull despite the miles of water between them. These were no depth charges. They were the violent death throes of Shokaku herself, her aviation fuel bunkers or magazines erupting in a cataclysm that sealed her fate. Aboard Shokaku, the drama had reached its crescendo. For a time, damage control teams fought like men, possessed, containing floods, quelling fires, patching breaches. But the torpedo wounds were too deep. Fuel lines ruptured, ventilation systems failed, and gasoline vapors crept silently into lower compartments, gathering in deadly concentration. At approximately 14 gauss, fate struck. Somewhere in the ship's shattered bowels, perhaps a spark from damaged wiring, perhaps a shard of overheated steel, the vapors ignited. The explosion ripped through Shokaku's interior with apocalyptic force. The armored flight deck heaved upward. Aircraft were hurled like toys. Crewmen were tossed into the air. Fireballs roared skyward, consuming anything that moved. Ammunition lockers ignited in a chain of thunderclaps, blasting shards of steel, and fire across the once proud carrier. At 14:10, Captain Matsubara Hiroshi gave the only order left to him. "Abandon ship." But for many below decks, it was already too late. Fire, flooding, and twisted wreckage trapped them in the carrier's collapsing heart. On deck, the list grew savage, 45 degrees and climbing. Men clung desperately to rails and bulkheads, only to slide helplessly across the burning flight deck and into the sea. Destroyer Urakaze and light cruiser Yahagi moved alongside the dying giant, their crews flinging ropes and lifebuoys, hauling screaming survivors. From the water, at 15:01, the Shokaku gave her final shudder. Rolling hard to starboard, she capsized, her stern lifting high before plunging beneath the waves. Massive explosions thundered from within as boilers met the sea, and remaining munitions detonated. A rising column of black smoke marked the spot, where moments before, one of Japan's proudest carriers had sailed. Then silence. Far below, Cavalla's crew listened to the last echoes fade through the ocean. They did not cheer. They only stared into the darkness, awed by the sound of a Leviathan's death. The mighty carrier that had once unleashed the thunder of Pearl Harbor, that had fought at Coral Sea, and endured countless battles across the Pacific, finally met her grave in the deep waters of the Philippine Sea. Of the 1,063 men aboard Shokaku, 1,272 went down with her. Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, true to the tradition of the Imperial Navy, chose not to abandon his ship. Only about 570 survivors were pulled from the waves by the Japanese escorts, but the loss of Shokaku was more than the sinking of a warship. It was the collapse of Japan's naval air power. On that very same day, the brand new carrier Taiho was also destroyed by USS Albacore. In a single blow, 2 of Japan's 3 fleet carriers were gone. Hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable veteran pilots vanished with them. The Japanese carrier force, once the terror of the Pacific, was broken beyond repair. To the Americans, June 19, 1944 would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. To the Japanese, it marked the death knell of their naval aviation. Aboard Cavalla, survival became the next battle. After more than 7 suffocating hours submerged, with batteries drained and air growing toxic, Commander Kossler ordered the submarine to periscope depth. To everyone's relief, the ocean was empty. The escorts had left to save what survivors, and they could. At 1900 hours, Cavalla broke the surface into the golden glow of a Pacific sunset. The hatches were thrown open, and exhausted men staggered topside, gasping the fresh sea air like men reborn. Diesel engines roared to life, driving cool, clean air back into the overheated steel coffin they had endured. Kossler's first act was to send a simple, electrifying message to Pearl Harbor. Attacked Shokaku-class carrier. 3 hits observed, heavy explosions, believed targets sank. At Submarine Force Headquarters, Admiral Charles Lockwood himself read the report. He penned a reply that would become etched into Cavalla's history. Well done, Cavalla. Achievement beyond expectations. 6 more weeks of patrol would follow, but nothing would ever match the intensity or the significance of June 19th. On July 1st, Cavalla sailed into Saipan, newly captured and still burning from battle. Hundreds of American warships filled the harbor, their guns still pounding Japanese positions ashore. Officers from Admiral Spruance's staff boarded the submarine to congratulate the crew. It was then that the men of Cavalla fully realized the magnitude of what they had done. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had cost Japan 3 carriers, over 600 aircraft, and the cream of their naval aviators. The mobile fleet, Japan's last great hope of striking back, had been shattered. The war would rage on for another 14 months, but after the Philippine Sea, Japan's fate was sealed. The sinking of Shokaku was more than the death of a ship. It was the symbol of a turning tide, an empire in retreat, and the beginning of the end for Japan's naval supremacy in the Pacific. The carrier that had once unleashed the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the blow that dragged America into war, was now resting at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. And the irony was profound, destroyed not by bombers or battleships, but by a single submarine from the very nation she had once awakened to battle. When the story of Cavalla's first war patrol was released after the war, it captured headlines and the imagination of a nation. Here was a submarine that, on her very first patrol, struck down one of Japan's most powerful carriers. From that moment forward, Cavalla became one of the most celebrated boats of the Pacific Fleet. She would go on to complete 5 more patrols, sinking 3 additional Japanese vessels. Yet nothing would ever surpass the thunder of that single spread of torpedoes fired on June 19, 1944. For that action, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kossler was awarded the Navy Cross, and Cavalla herself received the Presidential Unit Citation. But, to truly understand her victory, we must look at the broader war beneath the waves. American submarines made up less than 2% of the Navy's manpower, yet they were responsible for sinking more than half of all Japanese ships lost during the war. Over 2,000 warships and more than 1,100 merchant vessels, together strangling Japan's lifelines and dooming its empire of islands. The sinking of capital ships like Shokaku made headlines, but it was the slow, relentless destruction of Japan's merchant fleet that ultimately sealed its fate. Without oil, without supplies, without reinforcements, Japan's war machine starved to death. Still, Cavalla's attack carried lessons that echoed through the fleet. Kossler's decision to report the Japanese task force before attacking proved the value of submarines as scouts, not just hunters. His patience, making only 3 periscope observations before firing, became a textbook example of fire control discipline. And the survival of Cavalla under 105 depth charges, 56 of them dangerously close, was a testament to American submarine design and crew training. Even today, historians debate the final moments of Shokaku. Kossler reported 3 torpedo hits. Survivors swore there were 4. Some blame aviation fuel vapors, others the magazines for the catastrophic explosions that tore her apart. But one fact is undisputed. Combined with Albacore's sinking of Taiho, Cavalla's attack erased two-thirds of Admiral Ozawa's carrier force in a single day. Yet amidst the strategy and statistics, one must remember the human cost. Of the 1,663 men aboard Shokaku, 272 never came home. They were not faceless enemies, not fanatics, but sailors, many barely out of their teens, others veterans who had served aboard since her commissioning. They too were men doing their duty as they understood it. The wreck of Shokaku now lies silent in the deep, a steel tomb for her crew, and a reminder of the price of war at sea. Their deaths, though inevitable in the brutal logic of total war, were still human tragedies, over 1,200 lives extinguished in an instant. Among them were decorated officers who had fought since the first days of Japan's rise, and young recruits who never had a chance to grow old. The wreck of Shokaku has never been found. Unlike other great warships rediscovered in recent years, her shattered hull still lies somewhere in the silent depths of the Philippine Sea, broken, torn apart by the catastrophic explosions that ended her story. For the families of the 1,272 men who went down with her, the absence of a grave remains an open wound, a sorrow passed through generations. Cavalla, however, lived on. She survived the war, serving the U.S. Navy faithfully until 1969. In 1982, she was designated a National Historic Landmark, preserved today at Seawolf Park in Galveston, Texas. Visitors who step aboard can still feel the weight of history, walking through her narrow steel corridors, standing in the control room where life or death decisions were made in seconds, and looking through the very periscope Kossler raised to target Shokaku. She remains not just a relic, but a monument to the courage, skill, and sacrifice of the silent service. The strategic impact of Cavalla's action rippled far beyond that single day. The destruction of Japan's carrier air power in the Philippine Sea cleared the way for the liberation of the Philippines, the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and ultimately paved the road to Japan itself. Though the planned invasion never came, superseded by the atomic bombings, the naval supremacy established in June 1944 ensured America held the Pacific's future in its grasp. In the grand narrative of World War II, the sinking of Shokaku by Cavalla stands as a perfect symbol of the Pacific War's transformation. The once invincible Japanese Navy brought low by America's industrial power, advancing technology, and, above all, the determination and bravery of ordinary sailors beneath the waves. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippine Sea, the arc of history had come full circle. The hunter had become the hunted, and the empire that once dreamed of swift victory now faced certain defeat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than just a clash of steel and fire. It was a turning point that sealed Japan's fate. Even today, as tensions rise once more in the Western Pacific, the lessons of June 1944 remain strikingly relevant. The silent power of submarine warfare, the value of intelligence and reconnaissance, the irreplaceable importance of trained personnel, and the decisive edge of technological superiority. All of these echo across the decades, reminding us that naval supremacy, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. On the morning of June 19th, the Imperial Japanese Navy set out to deliver a decisive blow, a strike meant to halt America's advance across the Pacific. By sunset, that dream lay shattered. 2 fleet carriers sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, and Japan's last hope for offensive power slipping beneath the waves. And among the many heroes of that day, 72 men aboard USS Cavalla carved their place in history. In the suffocating depths of the Philippine Sea, they proved that even a single submarine, armed with courage, discipline, and steel, could alter the destiny of nations. Their achievement embodied the creed of the silent service. We sink them, regardless. Years later, Herman Kossler would reflect in his memoirs that the attack on Shokaku was both the result of years of training and the simple fact of being in the right place at the right time. But as Admiral Chester Nimitz once said, luck is the reward of those who are prepared to take advantage of opportunity. On that day, Cavalla was prepared. The opportunity presented itself, and with 6 torpedoes, she forever etched her name into the annals of naval history, not with ink but with fire and steel.